This tripod's messed up. I'm gonna have to get a new one.
Would you like it? You want it? Would you like it? You can buy it.
They're 15.
Our salon used to be down there. Welcome in the city.
So where's your husband?
He's still in Germany or again or whatever.
Selling it.
Well, actually, it's for Baba House, you
Oh, he
know.
may move there now.
So it's basically Angela. I made them, you know, she gave me the lockets and I said I had some beads, so I made them, but it's for Baba House. So it's Angela's in charge of Baba House.
Oh yeah, I know, but this is not for sale.
Yeah, they're all for sale. Sure, that's why we're making them to raise money for Baba House.
And I'm a, yeah, I think I'm a gift one. Thank you very much.
Great.
Very sweet. I'm just trying to think of how much more.
What's he doing? What's Horst doing in Germany?
Well, he's hoping that somebody else closes this deal they have been talking about since 2 years,
Oh,
where he's involved.
so everything's good?
Everything's good.
Yeah.
How have you been?
I haven't been, not so great, and my health hasn't been so good.
That's too bad.
I'm having some heart problems.
Here, yeah, I waited for half mile. Yeah, I have one bag for somebody.
I can memorize it all through so
Oh, really?
they can,
All right, worries you about a picture of this newsletters? I don't know, yes, but it might be, some of the picture boxes,
they,
Waiting for, you're here. Okay. Guys, it's time to start.
Let's start the meeting first.
Let's start the meeting. Before I introduce you our guest, special guest who met Baba, and I want to introduce you our newcomer, Roger. He just came first time. He's student of George. So he heard about Baba from George. So he came here first time, and you guys just know.
Make sure you're very nice to me.
Greet him.
Make sure you're very nice.
Can I just say that?
Give him a hug. After we finish, give him a nice hug.
A second newcomer.
Second, Veronica was here also last week, but there was last week was not quite such a formal meeting because there was hardly anybody
It's
here.
a
So
meeting, never formal, and you can introduce second Baba.
may I introduce my friend Veronica?
Who else? Next. Harvey. Next one. He disappeared from our view for a few years, but he comes back from Virginia special to see our guest speaker, Edward, who met Baba first time in 1961. and he met Baba in 1962. He was in the East-West Gathering. He's the Irving Locke's brother. So, but he, as far as I know, found out about Baba first.
That's right.
As a young boy, not child, but boy. So, and last time he was in 1969 when Les Darshan, so he and Irvin, and actually you saw the video with them, young, both. And he has 3 volumes of Baba's letters, which is going to be printed soon, so everybody will be familiar with them. So now I give him words because he will speak about his meeting with Baba and his experience with Baba much better than I, as I myself never heard him. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Okay. All righty. Well, first, I would like to thank, everyone that's on the staff that has made this here possible, that people such as myself and many, many others before me have been able to come, and many will after me. So I applaud all those that have put all their labor and love and sweat and everything into creating this for us. Thank you. Okay. Well, I believe it, for me, they say that long before the individual hears of the master, that the master is working with that person hundreds of years before they even hear his name, and working with them, in other words, preparing them for the time when that moment comes when they consciously become aware of their master, or the avatar, or one of the 5 masters. So with me, the way that preparation started, it started actually in 1954. There was a record that came out called Haji Baba, and I like that record. In fact, I liked that so much that it was the first record that I ever bought. And the whole song basically was Haji Baba, always in love, always in love. And so at that time, my father, we had a record machine. My father had bought one. And so he came home, and to his amazement and surprise, there was a record, which at that time was a 45 record, that was playing on the record machine, and since he bought it, it had never been used at all. And he comes in and he's hearing the lyrics, Haji Baba, always in love, always in love. And so he sees me sitting in the room and listening to this here. And, well, that was okay, he was surprised. But after 2 days, 3 days, he sees me walking through the living room, and it's playing, Haji Baba, always in love. And after a week of this here, he looks at me as the music is playing, Haji Baba. And he says, Haji Baba. And and I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me, and he says, Haji Baba, always in love, always in love. And I said, yes, Haji Baba is in love. So he didn't seem to say anything after that, but he's quite surprised that there was this music that kept playing over and over again. And then came the point where he decided to buy a record himself. And it was Johannesburg, and it was a very haunting kind of melody, and it was Johannesburg, Johannesburg. And he would listen to this Johannesburg over and over again, and I came out and I said to him, Johannesburg. So anyhow, I think that was the last record he had gotten, and then I got one later on, another one. But that record where it's a Haji Baba, that was the way, very subtly, that Baba was introducing me to the name Baba. And so I would always be thinking, Baba, Haji Baba. Okay, well, someone is coming in. We'll let them come in first. Okay. Yeah, well, okay. They'll have to come down and get a couple of seats for them. It's hard. Okay. So just come on in. Okay. Okay. All right. For the people that just came in, I was just talking about how I had first began to hear the name Baba, and it was through the. You'll have to wait till she calms down a little bit. Okay. So it was through that. So that was Baba's way of where I would begin to hear the name Baba over and over. And at that time, I had no thoughts of any thoughts of spirituality or any such thing. In fact, I remember I liked very much watching Dick Clark American Bandstand at that time, and that was basically the one of the shows that I would always watch. So anyhow, as time went on, and as I started to get, I must have been about 16, 17 years old. And so this is to give a little idea, because sometimes, if anyone, thinks, that when a person has met Mayor Baba, perhaps, they were, always spiritual. That they were like born with spirituality, and they were thinking about God and things like that. And with me, I had no such thoughts about God. In fact, I don't remember anyone ever mentioning the name God or any conversation related to God. The only thing I remember that when it was the holy holiday, the Jewish holiday, my father says, "Well, it's time to dress up." And that meant the suits went on, the ties went on, the cufflinks went on. And off to the shul at that time was the Jewish church, and everybody dressed up to the brim, and who could dress the best, and who had the nicest car driving up in front of the synagogue. Well, we learned real fast about these kinds of things at that time. Pardon?
You don't look Jewish.
There you are. Don't even look Jewish. So. No, you have to meet my mother. She had the big beak of a Jewish nose. Then you would see the Jewish thing there. Or perhaps my brother Erwin. Yes.
Much like a
Yes.
Jewish, Russian Jew.
Yes.
I thought that he's Russian Jew.
Absolutely. So anyhow, as time went on, to give an idea that for me, there was no such thing as the spirituality or anything like that, because sometimes people think, if a person met Mayor Baba, that they were experiencing, maybe visions of God, they were experiencing ecstasies and things like that. And if a person asked me, at that time what I experienced, I could tell them all about what a beautiful woman looked like, and what lips they had, and lovely hair. And I could tell them about the parties I was having, and I would invite them to a party. They wanted to have a good time. It says, come to one of my parties. You'll really have a good time. They says, what do you mean? I says, well, when we get the parties going, we have lots of rooms. And when the parties go, you can turn out the lights in the room. And they said, really? Yes. I says, we have great parties here. So at that time, if a party got filled up and people want to know about my spirituality, I would explain to them, I says, well, once I had one party filled up, then I had another place that I would tell people that were still coming to the party, they should go to that place now. And this included not only just the regular people, but the motorcycle people that had motorcycles, they were all welcome. And this was my, so to speak, they want to know about my spirituality at that time. That's exactly what my interests were and how things were at that time. But of course, my father wasn't around when I had the parties. He didn't know. He was out at the time. So he didn't know anything, except for a couple of broken beds one time. He wondered about that, but that was never explained. So anyhow, as time went on, then one day, my brother had asked me. He said, Edward, someone's going to give a talk, and maybe you'd like to come. And I said, a talk? And I thought this was very strange because my brother never spoke in terms of ever going to a talk or, some kind of, I says, a talk? He says, yeah, it's like a lecture. I says, you would go to a lecture? He says, well, it might be good, Edward. And I says, it might be good, a lecture might be good. And he said, yeah. He says, as a matter of fact, it's tomorrow evening. So if you're not doing anything, maybe you would like to come. So I says, well, I don't know about this, but if you want to go, you're welcome to go. So he said, well, think about it, Edward, and then let me know. So then came the following evening. And the following evening came, and I just happened to, I was walking around the house, and I wasn't doing anything in particular, and then he came up to me very quietly, and he says, how are you, Edward? And I says, oh, I'm fine. He says, are you doing anything? And I said, no, not that I can think of, no. And he says, well, remember what you said? I says, what did I say? He said, well, you said if you weren't doing anything, you might want to, there's a possibility you could come to the talk. I says, oh, the talk? I says, and then I realized that I'd already told him I wasn't doing anything, and I told him before I remembered that if I wasn't doing anything, that maybe I would go. And there he says, well, I says, okay, Erwin, I says, that was my brother's name, Erwin. I says, oh, okay, Erwin, I'm not doing anything. I try to have some kind of integrity as far as character. I don't know much what was there, but anyhow, I said, I'll go. So it turned out that we went, and it was a talk by Edgar, but it was by Hugh Lynn Casey, and he was talking about his father, Edgar Casey. And he was basically, it was a talk about his father's life, that he could, heal people at a distance and things like that, and there was a very big foundation around him. And also he could, it was like in a trance, almost like a trance-like state. He was always unconscious, but when he was unconscious, they could ask him questions, and he could know things about healing people, diagnose what they needed and things like that. And then also they found out that he could answer things spiritually about the nature of God. And so I myself thought, well, this is, it's interesting. I never heard anything like this before in my entire life, that someone, they could heal someone at a distance and things, but I don't recall, overly impressed, about that. It sounded very, very interesting. And then they had a little pamphlet, something about reincarnation there that they had, and it said, if you, through many lives, you can gain a lot of knowledge and reach a very high state. And all this made sense to me at that time. I said, yes, if a person had many lifetimes, they could gain a lot of knowledge then, but it would require many lifetimes. So I thought to myself, well, this is very interesting. And so then there came one little point where, he said that if anyone, had any questions, they could ask. And so, and he spoke about, his father had seen the light. So what occurred with me was, I was thinking, it didn't interest me too much what was really going on. However, when he asked if people have any questions, so at that time, my brother, he said, you can write it down and then they'll pass it up front. So what happened was that my brother started to write something down. And I says, oh, everyone's got a question. And so I thought to myself, well, so anyhow, then he started, they handed him the papers, and then the questions would be read out, and then came the question Erwin had. And they read out the question, and Erwin said, that's my question. And the question was, Hewlin was asked they was asked, have you ever seen the light? And Hewlin looked at that question, and he looked at it and he said, have I seen the light? He said, have I seen the light? He says, I've taken hot showers, I've taken cold showers, I've done all kinds of showers. I wouldn't be standing here if I hadn't seen the light. And at that point, I says, my God, this man hasn't seen nothing. I says, maybe his father saw something, but this man is now, his hair is like on fire in front of everyone. And I says, I don't think this is a safe place anymore. So I says, that was my experience as far as that evening. And Erwin asked me what I thought, and I says, well, Erwin, I says, I don't know what to think. There's something's the matter with this man. I think, he says, what do you mean? I says, I think he lost it up there. And I says, I think he needs to learn to control himself a little bit, take care of his behavior. There's lots of people around here. And so anyhow, but out of that came one thought, and it was very interesting that his father had seen what is referred to as the light. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting that, about this thing called the light. So then later on, as time went by, I decided, maybe I'll go to New York City. And at that time I was living in Miami with my brother Erwin, my father, my mother, and basically my three other brothers. And so I went to New York, and I became interested in, at that time I had some fascination with show business at that time. So I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll go to New York. That seems to be a place where they have, lots of theatrical agents and things like that. So I said, all right, I'll go to New York. So I went to New York, and then in New York City, I was making the rounds. I'd make the rounds of the different theater agencies and things like that, And that was pretty much my routine, and then I got a job as in the Palace Theater off Broadway here, around 40-some Street, which they still have today. There's still a little sign that says the Palace. It was a very famous theater at that time, and so I got a job there as an usher. In the meantime, there was a church not far from where I lived, and I went into that church, and I asked, there was a man that came over to me that was working in the church at that time, and he asked me, he came over to me, and he said, do you have any questions? And I said, do you know anything about the light? And he said, the light? He says, oh, yes, I know about the light. I says, you know about the light? He says, yes, a friend of mine experienced the light. I said, really? He said, yes. He says, when he experienced that light, he knew the solution to all problems. He was in harmony with everything. And I said, wow, that's great. And I said, how's he doing with the light? He said, well, he lost the light. I said, he lost the light? And he said, yes, he lost. I says, how can you lose the light? He said, he misused the knowledge of the light. And I said, he misused the knowledge? And he says, yes, when he misused it, then the light, then he lost the experience of the light. And he said, well, I says, well, what happened? He says, well, he's looking for the light. And I says, oh, he's looking for the light. So then at least I knew, I'd heard at least one thing, that there was such a thing from someone else called the light. So I says, oh, so this thing about a light, it does exist. It's really so. And then one day I went in there again, and he said to me, and I was thinking, I says, you know what, maybe what I need to do is, for this experience, is to gain a communication with God. And then I could have the experience of this light. And so I says, yeah, that's a good idea. You thought of something good, if you can gain a communication with God, you'll come to know about the light. And I like that. So I says, all right, we're going to have to prepare. You're going to have to get prepared for this, because anything could happen now. Once you step into wanting to know something from God, you don't know what you're stepping into, so you got to be ready for everything and anything. So, and I says, this is not going to be like your old life. This isn't like holding parties and things. You got to be aware of what you're doing. This is unknown territory. Are you ready? I says, yeah, I'm ready. I want to know what the light is. So I had a room in New York. It was like a little hotel room, and the hotel room, all that, what it basically had, I was trying to even remember myself. All I remember it had was a bed, and basically, and there was a chair. And there was no light in the room. I mean, there was no light that came into the room. There was just one bulb. And until you made it to the bulb, when you came in, you were in the dark. So you had to pull a string, and then you could see what was there in the room where you were standing. And that was really it. However, that was something that was very affordable for me at that time. So what occurred now, I says, now we're going to start to see about how you can go about seeing the light. And I says, the way you got to do it, you have to gain the communication with God. So at that time, what I said, all right, I'm going to get the communication with God. So I said, all right, what you got to do now to show me that you're serious, I says, are you willing to turn the light off and be in the big black room, and where you can really show me you're sincere, you really want to see the light? I'm talking to myself. And I says, yes, I'm willing to turn the light off. I want to see the light. And I said, okay, so I turned the light off. After I turned the light off, I was in the pitch black. And I'm sitting there saying, well, God, here I am.
How's your chance, God?
Here I am, and now I want to gain a communication with you. So now I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for God to maybe talk to me or show something to me, show himself. And I'm sitting there and I'm waiting, and then I'm begin to wonder, well, where is God? How come, if there is a God, then how come he's not showing himself? And then I says, well, maybe he didn't hear you. I said, God, I'm here! I'm here! I'm here because I want to gain a communication with you. And anyhow, after kind of standing up and sitting down in the pitch black, and then finally I got, I think, maybe a little exhausted, and because nothing was happening, and so then I just figured, well, maybe if you're silent enough, maybe you can hear something. Maybe God is trying to say something, but your mind is going too much and you can't hear nothing. So I got very quiet and very, very still at that point. And then, at that time, maybe 45, 50 minutes had passed, and it was going on to an hour, and then I started to hear something in the room. I says, I felt something, something like went by, and then I felt something go by on the other side, and then I felt something going over, and then pretty soon I says, I think there's something going on in this room here that I can't see what's going on, but it seems like things are getting busy in this room. And then again, I felt something, and then more and more, and I says, I started to get a little concerned. I says, I think the place is getting crowded. I'm hearing things, I'm feeling things, and I says, and then I suddenly thought to myself, this is very, very unusual. And I says, what's unusual? I says to myself, well, I'm sitting here and because I wanted to gain a communication with God, and now all this other stuff is going on. And I had never been exposed to anything like this here. And then pretty soon the room, it seemed, was so packed with things going here, going there, and so busy. And finally I said, I'm here to gain a communication with God, and I can see this is getting in the way. So I says, you know what? I says, I don't know who you are. Are you paying rent? Because if you're not paying rent, this place cost me something. And unless you're willing to put your money down, then I don't know why you're here. The room cleared out. No money came before me. Nothing was laid down. And now it was back to an empty room. And I sat in that room. And I sat. And then finally I thought to myself, it doesn't seem, it says, it's 3 hours. And you know something? You're already 2 hours late for your job. And I says, you're 2 hours late. I can see, you were very serious, but it doesn't look like anything is happening, that God is going to have any kind of communication with you at this time. And so I said to myself, I says, well, I remembered something. And what it was, I remember reading something where it said that if when you pray to God or something like that, if it doesn't happen at the time, it doesn't mean that it won't happen. It just means that it's meant to happen at a later time. And I says, well, I must be one of those people where it's going to happen at a later time. I says, 3 hours is enough. So I says, now is the next thing. So I says, turn on the light. I turned on the light, and I says, now you're going to have to go to your job. And I thought, well, is God now watching over me because I'm walking in 2 hours late? What's going to happen now? And So I went went a few blocks to the theater where I worked, and there you wore uniforms at that time as an usher, and I walked in and I put on my uniform, and I was looking around at the other usher, and the managers, things like that, to see, what they were going to say to me now. And I says, nobody's saying anything to me. It's like nobody is aware whatsoever that I hadn't been there for the 2 hours. And I says, then I says, well, maybe I should just go to my post where I'm supposed to stand. And at that time, there was this other usher at that time during the daytime, and his name was Blackie. And Blackie was very busy at that time. And I says, he's with the vending machine. He had a way of putting his hand all the way up into the vending machine. And I says, what are you doing, Blackie? He says, well, this is the way you make extra money. He says, this is the way you make extra money. He says, yeah, you go from machine to machine, and then you make money this way. He says, if you're interested, I'll show you how to make extra money. And I said, well, Blackie, I says, I think I got to go to my post. And then I went off to my post. And so then not long after that, something very interesting had occurred. And I had thought, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll go to the New York Public Library, and what I'll do is get a book on maybe things that will help me as far as my show business career in the way of memory. And I says, well, what is your idea to improve your memory? And I says, so I was thinking, and I says, and I had to think, what is my idea? I says, well, the idea is this. I've heard about, these Indians in India where they can put pins in their arm, pins in their ears, they can lay on nails, they can do all kinds of very, very unusual things. And I says, now, these are fantastic, these are tremendous techniques. Now, they have a technique for memory like they do, where you can lie on nails or cut yourself with glass and not bleed and all these things. And if they have a technique for memory, boy, this will be fantastic. So I says, all right, I'm going to go to the India section on Indians and find out they got a technique. So I went into the New York Public Library that they have here in New York City, and I went up to it was the 3rd floor where they have the books on India, and I went over there, and then I was looking at some of the books. I didn't know which one to pick, but as long as it was from India, I figured, well, there's got to have something in it. And so one book I picked out, and the name of the book was Listen, Humanity. And so I looked at the book, Listen, Humanity, and I was just looking at that cover. And I says, Listen, Humanity. I says, what a name. This man, it was so important to him that humanity should listen, that he titled his whole book, Listen, Humanity. And I says, well, I'm part of humanity. And if he can ask and want so much to title that book for someone to listen, I says, I'll do it. I took the book to the table, and then I opened up the book, Listen, Humanity. And of course, I opened the book up, and there was a picture at that time of a man, and he had a nice garland on himself. And thinking, I says, a garland? Oh, Hawaiian. I says, Hawaiian. And then right away, with a Hawaiian thing, I thought of, that followed that right up in my mind, the harems. The Hawaiians and the harems. And I says, oh, so that's what it appeared to me like. That was the imagery that was coming to me. And so then anyhow I says, well, what I'm going to do now is, so I started to read the book. I started to read a couple of pages, and then I says, I'm reading, and then there's where Don Stevens, his book, This in Humanity, is describing the Mayor Baba, and he's talking about some of the interviews with Baba. And I thought to myself, these interviews are really something, because the things that Mayor Baba is saying to these people individually, that if I did any of the things he said, I couldn't help but become a better person. I was impressed at that point, so I said, all right. And then I saw where Baba was bathing the lepers, washing them, and some of the pictures in the book in itself at that time. And I says, oh, so Baba is, he really, is helping people too. And then there was the part where he was talking about people loving him. He says, that people should love him. And I says, well, I don't know why he's bothering to ask people to love him. I don't know what that has to do with, everything was good up till that point, instructing and guiding people. And I had quickly grasped one thing at that time. I said, it seems to me what Baba has, because when it comes to God, he can answer their questions, except, I says, he's conscious. Which means, whereas Edgar Casey was unconscious, that Baba at that time, because they had mentioned something about the universal mind at that time in one of the books I read about in relation to Edgar Cayce, and I said, so the difference is Baba seems to be conscious of the universal mind, where he can work directly at the source of knowledge, and he doesn't have to be unconscious. And that was my impression at that time. And then so I says, well, this is great. This is great stuff. So I says, well, Eddie, I says to myself, what are you going to do now? I says, well, I'm going to just put the book back on the library stand. And then the next thought that came to me as I was thinking, I says, well, Eddie, you're very young. And I says, what does that have to do? As I'm just rattling these thoughts off of my own mind. I says, well, do you know anything about truth? And I says to myself, I says, no, I don't know nothing about truth. And he says, well, can you afford to go through your entire life know nothing about truth? And I thought about that, and then I realized, well, maybe I should know a little something. After all, I do have a long road ahead of me, and to go down that road and not know anything about truth, this could, I might have problems, and it might be helpful. So I said, well, then maybe, I should take the book and learn and read more about truth. So at that time I decided, yes, of course, this is what I'll do. I'll take the book then. But there was a problem. And I says, this is a thick book. It's a very heavy book, and you're going to have to carry this all the way to your room. And I thought about that as being a very thick, heavy book, and did I want to carry a thick, heavy book? And then I thought again. I says, well, then the thought came to me, well, what you still don't know nothing about truth, so what are you going to do? Go through your whole life? And I says, well, maybe then I should actually not think so much about the book being heavy. So I got past that one. I says, well, now you're going to have to get a library. You're going to have to get a library card, that. And I says, oh, you got to have some kind of an IQ for this here, And I says, I don't know about you, Edward, you got to, start filling out forms and doing all kinds of things, this is going to get out of control. This is way over your head now. So I says, yeah, nice. Then the thought came again, well, what do you know about truth? And I says, nothing. He says, well, maybe you got to face the librarian and get a library card. And I thought, yes, maybe this is something I should do. So I went up to the librarian with the book, This in Humanity, and I said to her, I'd like to get a library card. And then she said, well, and she says, that's nice. And she says, well, just, she put a little piece of paper on the counter, and she says, sign this. And I could sign my name. I mean, I could do that. So I says, oh, all right, I'll sign. I signed my name. And then she says, now you have, now you can take the book. I says, I can take the book? She says, yes, now you have a library card. And just bring the book back. And I says, yes, I can do that. And then she said, by such and such a date. And I says, I can handle that, and there's no problem. And anyhow, so then I took the book home with me and to my room, and I started reading it. And I became very interested as I'm reading this book now. And as I'm reading the book, I says, you know, this Mayor Bob is, you know, very, very advanced. He really can, you know, help people. And so then I got very, very interested to the point where I remember reading it during my breaks. I would read the book. And during my breaks at work at the Palace Theater, and then I remember one time I think Blackie, his name Blackie, came up to my room and asked me if he could stay in my room, and I didn't know he didn't have a place. I said, well, you can use the floor because I don't have there's no other bed in here. And so he said, that's all fine, you know. So he said he'll use the floor, and so he used the floor. And then it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. He's counting some of he's counting these little pebbles. At that time I didn't know anything about drugs or things, and he's counting all these little, I found out, you know, they're pills. He's counting, and like the gold or something, and then he swallows one, and he says, what are you doing? And he says, well, you don't want to know anything about this, Ed. And then he was up, he's full of energy, and he says, I'm going out. And then he left the room. And he says, there's some strange stuff he's taken there, because in the middle of the night he's now leaving. So anyhow, I continued on with my book, reading it, and then I says, you know what, I got to call my brother Erwin and let him know about this book. So I called up Erwin, and when I called up Erwin, and he was in Miami at that time, living with my parents, and so he had answered the phone. I said, and I says, Erwin, and he said, yes. I says, well, this is your brother Edward. I'm from New York, and he says, well, hello. I says, hello. Then I says, there's a book I think, you know, you might be interested in. And he says, what's that? And I says, it's a book about Mayor Baba. So he said he couldn't pronounce the name. He said, Mayor Ba. And I says, no, Mayor Baba. And then finally he just couldn't get the name. So he handed the phone to my mother. He says, maybe you can know what the name is. So I said to my mother, the name is Mayor Baba. And so she said, Mayor Baba. And I said, yes, Mayor Baba. So then she spoke to my brother and said to him, the name is Mayor Baba. So anyhow, and I said, if there's the book in the Miami library, you might find it very interesting. So he said he would do that. And that was the first time Erwin had ever heard the name Mayor Baba. So then, anyhow, then a little time passed now, and going back to the part about a communication, gaining a communication with God, there was things that were to happen which were happening very subtly, which I didn't know that was going to be answered as time would begin to reveal that. So anyhow, I was thinking now, the important thing, that it's real important, because after reading the book, Listen Humanity, the one thing I got from the book was that God does exist. If anyone could have the kind of compassion that Baba had for the lepers and the poor and helping people the way he was doing, in the poorest of villages, I says, God exists. And so then I got excited, and I says, my mission now is I have to find a way to experience God. And so that became my thought in front of my mind, and then I read something about where a person was in a monastery for 10 years, and then after 10 years he gained a communication with God. So he says, well, maybe that's what I got to do. I got to go to a monastery for 10 years, and then I'll gain the communication with God, if that's what it takes. So anyhow, then just at that time, it was coming right into Christmas, and there was a man. It was a producer that sought me out where I was working at the Palace Theater, and he said to me, he came over and someone said, there's someone that wants to see you, and I met the man, and he says, I'm going to be doing 4 movies, and I have a part in it. For you in each one of the movies, but you'd have to be willing to travel to some different countries as well. And I was thinking to myself, the thing that I was thinking about was the thought about God and the importance of, if I go through my whole life, and I'm playing the roles of different people as an actor, I'll never know who I am. And I'll just be experiencing, so to speak, all these, it's like a counterfeit experience of different roles, but never knowing the inner truth. And so I said to him, I says, I don't know if I'm going to be visiting my parents in Miami, so, I'm not even going to be around. And he said, well, I have I have all the crew together. I just have a few technical things to do with some of the cameras and things like that, but I'd really like you to be in these movies. So I said at that time, I said, well, I don't know, because I'm not sure when I'm going to be back. So he said to me, well, in case you decide, you want to be in the movies, I'm going to hold up everything for 2 weeks. And if you return within 2 weeks, then I want you to be in these movies. And he gave me his card. And so then I left at that time for Miami. So shortly, I left within maybe about 4 days or so after that. Then I went to, and when I arrived in Miami, some very interesting things were going on at that time. Well, one thing that was going on was that my brother was talking to my father, and he told my father, he says, I have an intuition that I have an intuition about going to New York and experiencing God. So my father, didn't say too much, and then I remember I went upstairs where my room was and where Erwin's room was also, and then Erwin said to me, he says, Eddie, I have this intuition that if I go to New York, that I can gain a communication with God. So I says, wow, that's something. I had no idea that he had any interest whatsoever in God. So anyhow, then he said, you know what I'm going to do? And I says, no, what are you going to do? He says, well, I'm going to go downstairs and tell my father that I'm going to go to New York to gain a communication with God. And I says, you're going to go downstairs and tell him you're going to gain a communication with God in New York City and you're leaving Miami now? He says, yes. And so Erwin at that time, when when he went downstairs, Erwin didn't quite walk downstairs. He was so excited that he just bounced down the stairs, boom, 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 boom. And then he went to tell my father the wonderful news that he's now going to be leaving for New York City to gain a communication with God. And I says, oh boy, this is real good. So anyhow, then I began to feel like it was like a rumbling in the house. And I could feel the floor beneath me shaking already. And I says, oh my God, he told him. He actually told him. So then Erwin came up the stairs and he says, well, I told him. And then my father at that point was talking to my mother downstairs, and you can hear him all the way upstairs, and he says, well, there are people, that, he says, this is really, crazy, because what's wrong with him? He can go to the church right down the street. And if he goes to the church down the street, he could have God right there, but no. He's got to go to New York City to find God now, and then he'll have whatever it is he's looking for. So Erwin comes downstairs, and then my father is there, and he says, I figured it out, son. And he says, what did you figure out? He says, you're going to go to New York, and it's like Moses. You're going to go there, and you're going to come back with something like the 10 Commandments. And everyone said, I don't think that's what I'm going to New York for, is to come back to Miami like with something like the 10 Commandments. He says, this is not what it's really about. And he says, yes, this is, I can already see it now. You're wanting to be another Moses. And that's what's really going on. So anyhow, Erwin, of course, was very persistent in his approach. He was going to go to New York, and he did leave for New York. And while Erwin was in New York, with myself, I said to him, I thought, well, maybe what I'll do is, I think at that time what I was doing was, it was suggested that, maybe I should just finish some of my schooling. So I said, yeah, maybe I'll just finish some of the schooling in the meantime till I can figure out how I can gain my communication with God and where I have to go and what I have to do next. So in the meantime, the name Baba started coming into my mind, and I didn't know why. I says, why is Baba's name coming into my mind? But it was like came with like a very nice, sweet feeling. So this would go on day after day. I would just, attend the classes, and I would sit between the classes, and then I would hear like Baba's name. It's like a repetition in my mind. And I says, this is very, very unusual. So at that time, but I didn't seem to mind because it felt really nice. So then I hear from Erwin. This was, must have been a month or 2 months later, and Erwin says to him, Erwin is there, and he sent me, he sent me a little pamphlet of Meher Baba, from Purdom, and had a little picture of Meher Baba on it, and it had what Purdom's experience was of meeting Meher Baba. So I thought to myself, apparently Purdom had a very nice experience with Baba. And so anyhow, I put it on my desk, and it had that picture there. And I would pass in front of the picture back and forth in my bedroom, and I noticed that there was something unusual about the picture. I says, there's something about this picture that's very unusual, and I'd always catch it out of the corner of my eye. I says, there's something. So one day I says, you know what, I'm going to sit down and really take a look at this picture to see what it is about this picture that seems to be unusual. So at that point, I sit down at the desk, and I'm looking at the picture, and I'm looking at it. And I said, I must have been sitting there for maybe about 4 minutes or 5 minutes, which was not easy for me to ever sit still. And I said, I don't think anything is happening. So, I don't know what it is, but I do know there's something about the picture, so I should make the extra effort to really see, what it is about this picture that is unusual. So I looked at the picture, and then something began to happen. I says, and I'm looking at it, I says, he's suffering. I says, he's suffering. And then I says, he's really suffering. And then the next thought that occurred to me, I says, this is not ordinary suffering. This is not how you see suffering. This is not suffering because it's something that he can't get for himself, that he's wanting for himself. This is the suffering for something that he wants to give. And it's very difficult. What he wants to give is very difficult to be received. And the suffering is that of this like resistance to what he wants to freely give, with no strings or anything like that attached. It's a pure giving. This is something that's very pure. And then I said, wow. And then I saw the suffering again of the resistance to what he was so freely giving of. And I says, the Christ suffering. I says, this is the suffering of Christ. It's like a tremendous suffering. And at that point, I said, the Christ. And I said, so this is the Christ. And mind you, I had no upbringing as far as, the Christ or Christianity or anything like that, other than what I had heard, a little something about the crucifixion. That's about all I knew. And but I immediately identified it as a tremendous kind of suffering that was coming from that same place. And so I said, oh, so you're here again. And I said, so you're here again. And immediately I recognized that the, so to speak, the enlightened one or the Messiah or whatever the Rasul, whatever the name or the enlightened one, what it comes under, I says, oh, so you're here again. And then I got up from the desk, and I just kind of went over to the beach, which I usually would go to, and then shortly after that, my brother Erwin called me from New York City, and he said, Eddie, he said, I've read about Meher Baba, and you know what? I would like to meet Meher Baba, and I was wondering, if you would like to also meet Meher Baba. So, I said to him, I says, I think that would be a wonderful idea, that we should both go and meet, Meher Baba. He said, all right, he says, I'll try to figure something out, how we can get the, maybe the money or things like that. So I thought to myself, I says, yes. I says, yeah, if there's whatever you can do, yeah, I think would be a really good thing. So at that point, we hung up the phone, and then a little time went by, and I remember I was driving in my car, and then I had another awakening. And as I was driving in my car, I suddenly realized my life had no meaning. It had no real purpose. And I says, your life has no meaning, no real purpose at all whatsoever. And at that point, I experienced like an emptiness or a void. And I felt, I felt really terrible. I says, your life is like meaningless. It has no value, no direction, nothing. And then I remembered something. And what I remembered was what Baba said in the book, Listen Humanity. He said, if you call out to me, then I will be with you. So I figured, well, you know what I'll do that. I'll call out to Baba. So in my mind, I called out to Baba. I think it was 3 times real loud in my mind. And after I called out 3 times, inwardly, I started to get filled with this joy, this happiness. And the happiness rose and rose and rose in me. And I was watching that happiness in me go higher and higher. And I says, wow, this is fantastic. I've never felt such happiness, such joy, such exhilaration. And I says, wow. And then I thought, this is amazing. I says, I've never experienced the height of this kind of happiness. And at that point, all I remembered was that I started to remember what Baba said in the book, Listen to Humanity. He said, I am not the body. You know, I am infinite consciousness. I am everywhere. And then I said, oh, so you're not the body, just this physical body in India. And then I realized he had just reached me halfway around the world. And I said, wow. So at that point, then of course as time went by, then I started to hear, you know, from my brother said he was having it, you know, a little difficult in getting the rest of the money for the trip to meet Mayor Baba. And in the meantime, he had already written ahead to Baba. And Baba said to him that, you know, if he wanted to come, he could come for 1 hour. And after my experience of Baba as the avatar, that he was the Messiah and he was here again, I had then shortly right after Owen wrote, then I wrote, and to Baba saying, Mayor Baba, I believe you to be the avatar. And Baba's response to that was immediate. He said, I want, you know, you and your brother should both come together to see me. And then I shared that with my brother Erwin, that Baba wants us both, that now we should both come together. And so anyhow, Erwin came back. At that time, he came back to, he couldn't make the money in New York, so he came back to Miami and figured, well, he's going to have to come up with another idea. So the next idea was basically, I'll just kind of like, Erwin came up with an idea. My father was going to be out of town, and my father already had made Erwin vice president of his business, which was the real estate business. So when my father, he was going out of town for some reason or something like that, yeah, he was a little depressed about, you know, what my brother and I, you know, we had thoughts about. He already knew we had thoughts about meeting Mayor Baba and wanting to go to India and things like that. And so my uncle felt sorry for my father, because my father was now suffering that we weren't listening to him, we weren't forgetting Mayor Baba and things like that, and he was having problems, and he realized we wanted to see Mayor Baba. And then then he came up with an idea that you know, that could sway us from the whole idea of being with Mayor Baba. And so he said, you know, there's someone I want you to meet. And I says, well, he's never asked us to meet anybody. He never thought we were worthy at this point, especially of meeting anybody, the way he was looking at my brother and I like we were crazy. But he says, I have a very important person maybe that you'd like to meet. And he says, there's an important person that we'd like to meet. And he says, oh yes, you know, he's a very prestigious person as well. So when my father, you know, asked for something, it was never a question. It was never a thing where you knew when you spoke to my father, there was only one answer that you could respond to him, and that was yes. And you would never say no. And so whenever he asked for anything to be done or wanted anything, you knew with him that anything, it was forbidden to answer or give advice or say anything that you might think or on your own or have any idea coming from your own intelligence. That was out of the question. So when he said, I have someone for you to meet, we just knew, yes, you have someone for us to meet. We'll be glad to meet this person. So we knew, of course, there's something out up his sleeve. So we... He said, now come with me. And so we came with him in this big, beautiful car, and he took us he says, I'm going to introduce you to a very, very prestigious man. This man is the most prestigious man in Miami Beach. And so we came up to this big, beautiful synagogue. And he says, now you're about to meet the chief rabbi of all rabbis. And I'm going to introduce you both to him. And whatever he says, you should listen to. So we went into this big synagogue, and we met the rabbi. And the rabbi looked at us, and then my father told him, he says, I have these two sons, and they're thinking of this man, Meher Baba, in India, and I found out that they want to see him. And and they think that this is going to help them towards God, that they're going to be able to get closer and have the experience of God. So, and he says to the rabbi, he says, what do you think of such a thing, that they're going to go to this Meher Baba and they're going to find God? And the rabbi, and he says, what is going on with them? So he says, and he looked at us, and we told him, he says, yes, this is what we want. And we told him we want to have the experience, to have, more of an experience of God. And so he looked at my father, and he says, well, I can tell you, Mr. Luck, what it is. And my father was now waiting for the right answer. And he said, my father, and the rabbi said, Rabbi Lehrman, he said, they have what is referred to as the calling. And my father says, the calling? He says, yes, they have a calling. And then my father, he said, well, what is that? And then there was a lamp in the room, and then he turned on the lamp and the light went on. And he said, that's what the calling is like. The light went on, he turned the switch, the light went on. He says, when the light goes on like that, it means the person has the calling. So they had the calling. So my father, well, that was obviously the wrong answer. And my father said, I had a few words with him. He says, I got to speak to you alone. And you and I have to have a talk. He sent my brother and I out, and I think he told the rabbi he wasn't going to contribute to his church anymore, and a few things like that. And, and this was not good news. And you are no help. You're no help to anybody as far as I can see. And then my father figured, now my father was so angry, he went over all of his bad points. Whatever he had heard about, he told him all of his bad points, and this is now we can, because this rabbi is useless. So we left. And then shortly after that, of course my father was now, he wasn't very happy. He was depressed because he saw that my brother and I we still had these thoughts about going to India. So now my uncle felt sorry for my father. He says, Morris, he says, I can see you're really feeling bad, but I have an idea. And he says to his brother Louis, what's that? He says, I can see, this is ruining your health, what they're like and what they're trying to do, and they're going against you and everything. So the thing that probably would make you feel better if maybe you and I, he says, maybe if you went to New York and bought yourself a really nice Cadillac. my father thought about that, and he says, Louis, would you come with me to New York so I see this Cadillac you're talking about? He says, yes. He says, yes, Morris, anything that'll make you feel better again. He says, all right, well, Lou, if you're willing to come, with me, we'll go to New York. So anyhow, at that time, then as time went on, Erwin and I were figuring out, how we could make the money. So Erwin came up with an idea for a big land sale, a big bonanza land sale. And so Erwin took out a full-page ad saying bonanza sale, land sale. And anyhow, I saw it in the paper, and what he put in and everything, and it looked very big. It was very big, and it looked really impressive. And he says, well, so then Erwin went up to the office, at that day, when the people were invited to come for the big land sale, and Erwin was there, and then first nobody was there, and then Erwin says, it doesn't seem like anybody is coming, and then you start to hear some people coming up the stairs, then more people. Some people came up, and then some other people came up behind him, and and they said, I want the land. I want that bonanza land. And so now, Erwin, without even asking many questions, they just wanted to have their name put down and buy the land. They wanted that bonanza land. So anyhow, there was a landslide of business that came in at that time. So, and Erwin was saying, well, maybe, Bob is really helping us, at this time, because it seems like we're, I don't know where all these people came from. But, so Erwin and I then set out, because we got the timing to leave for New York, and now my father had come back, and Erwin and I had already figured out the timing and everything, and we had the money. So we then left from Miami to New York City. So when we got to New York, we had everything scheduled for the airport to go, and that was in 1960. And when we got at the airport, we were just going to go inside. We had, the passports, everything. So then when there were two men that came up to us, they said, are you Erwin and Edward Luck? And we said, yes. And they said, well, can you come with us for a few minutes? So we thought, and they said, well, and I knew something was up. I says, this doesn't look good at all. So they said, well, you just can be detained for just a little bit. So they took us into a room, and in that room they said to us, they says, where are you going? And we said to India, and they said, well, that's okay. How do you plan to go? And he says, well, we plan to go. We have the tickets, and we have the money, and different things. And that's how we're going to go. So he said, how did you happen to get the money? And we said, well, we worked for it, and so therefore we have the money. And then one of them went out through a door, and then came back out from that door, and he says, well, maybe it's not a good idea that you go on this trip. Did you ever think of that? And just forget it, And they said, no, we're not forgetting this trip, because this is very important that we go on this trip. And they said, well, what is this trip for? And they said, well, it's a journey to meet Mayor Bob. It's a spiritual trip. And then the guy goes out the door again. And then he comes back, and then says to us, he says, well, maybe what you should do is forget about this whole thing and just not do anything. And he says, no, we're not going to just not do anything. We're going to, because there's still a little bit of time we want to board the plane. So then he went out the door, and then the door opens up, and then my father walks in. And he says, all right, you guys, you've really done it this time. And he says, what have we done this time? He says, well, tell them that, that all this money belongs to me that you have now. And he says, what do you mean it belongs to you? He says, we worked for the money. We had a big sale. And he says, no, the money is not yours. The money is all mine. And therefore you should just turn everything over to me. So Erwin says, he says to me, don't sign anything. Because we had everything, a lot of money in traveler's checks. And he says, then one of the men there says to us, says, why don't you turn the money over to him? He says, because if the money is not yours and you just split you just took all the money, he says, then my brother says, well, being the vice president of the company, why would I steal from myself? And then he looked at my father as to why he would steal from himself if he's the vice president. He says, and he asked Mr. Locke, he says, he's vice president of your company? And he says, well, they're no good. He says, what do you mean they're no good? He says, why are they no good? He says, the pain this has caused my mother, his wife. He says, my wife, they're thinking about going to India and going off to travel to this man in India. And he says, well, Mr. Locke, this is, we thought, I think this is a family problem. And then they realized, these weren't con men that had come in and stole from his company. These were actually, he started to realize, he says, these are his sons. And he says, Mr. Luck, what do you think we should do? He says, they should go to jail. That's what I think they should do. Look how they've hurt everybody. So, at that point, they say, well, Mr. Luck, I don't know if it's such a good idea, that you put them in jail. And he says, well, what would be the charge, Mr. Luck? And he says, the charge, he says, there is a charge. He says, you see this one here? He's underage. So, and this one is overage. So this one here is kidnapping the underage one and taking him to India, and that's your charge. We've got a kidnapper on our hands. He says, well, Mr. Luck, he says, I don't know if this is such a good idea. Maybe you should talk this out. And at that point, my father said, well, you can't even talk to these guys. It's useless. But I'm a sucker. So what I'll do is I'll take them with me. And then at that point, he says, nothing will change, he tells them. They'll still be the same, you'll see. But because nothing can be done with them, I'll take them with me. Out of the goodness of my heart. And so he then took, so then we left with my father. So now, then about part of the day has gone by, and then my father says to me, he says, Erwin is not eating. I says, he's not eating? He says, no, he's not eating. I says, and I looked at Erwin, and Erwin looked really unhappy. And I could see Erwin, obviously, apparently, I could see, I guess he's not eating. And so my father says to him, he says, you got to forget this thing about India. And Erwin's not even talking. So then my father tried talking to us about forgetting it, and then he saw it wasn't working. So he says, okay, this is what I'll do. He says, only what I'm willing to do is only one of you can go, but one has to stay. And but you both can't go. That I'm not going to accept. So I knew legally he had me over a barrel, and I was the one that wasn't going to go, So I figured, well, it's better that one goes, at least while he's in the mood, and that one can go. It's better that one gets through, and then I could figure a way to follow up Erwin later. So that was the plan now. I says to Erwin, I says, look, he's willing to have one of us go, so I'll try to figure out something where I can follow you up. And Erwin said, well, are you sure? Because maybe there's something, maybe we can still do something. I says, I don't know. The way he is, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. So best that at least as long as he's saying one could go, you go ahead. So Erwin at that point then said to my father, all right, he says, I'm going to go, and Edward will go back. So at that point, that was the thing. Then I was on the plane. So Erwin boarded the plane. In the meantime, then I was on my way back to Miami, and I said, well, I'm just not eating anything. And then something happened. As I was going back, and I wasn't eating anything, I got this terrific, it was like an intuition that everything was going to be okay, and things are going to work out. So at that point, I suddenly realized it doesn't matter whether I have anything or not, because everything is going to be okay. So then I think I ordered a hot chocolate, and then I flew into Miami, and then things started to change in Miami. After a few days I was there, I started to experience this something very unusual, something that was like it was like a phenomenal feeling. And so I went to the beach, which I usually do, and there was a friend of mine looked at me, and he said to me, he says, Eddie, he must have been about maybe 30 feet from me. And he saw me and he looked at me and he says, Eddie, he says, it's like you're radiating. And then it occurred to me for the first time, I said, it seems like there's something that I can't see that's happening, that's going on. So then the following day, I went on to the beach, and then another friend that I had, as soon as he saw me, which was also about 30 feet away, he says, Eddie, he says, there's something about you like a light. And then this other friend says, he says, oh yes, he says, Eddie glows these days. So then I was around the beach, and I began to realize something's going on here, something very unusual. And then I just kind of sat down by it was like a ledge that you could sit, and I sat on that ledge, and then there was these two little boys playing in the sand on the beach, and then they must have been about maybe 5 or 6, and then one of them got up, and he came over towards me, and then he went around, climbed up this little ledge, and then he put both of his legs around me from behind and both of his arms, like piggyback style, and then he went motionless. And at that point, I realized he's absorbing this power of this experience that was going on, that I was experiencing. And he stayed on my back totally silent for maybe, about 3 minutes. And then he got off. And then the other little boy, that apparently was his brother, then he got up on the ledge, and then he put his legs around me from behind and his arms around me, and then he went totally silent. And I realized he's sponging up this experience. He's like being fed, internally being fed. And so he was there about 3 minutes also. So then he got off, and then I went home and I was wondering, how is it that I'm experiencing this kind of thing? I mean, I knew nothing about what they call meditation or prayers or these yoga things, So I says, how is this thing happening? And so when I went into the house, my mother said, there's a telegram for you. And I says, a telegram? I was surprised. He sends me a telegram. I never had a telegram in my entire life. So at that point, what occurred is I read the telegram, and then it says, time and distance mean nothing to me, and that you will benefit equally, the same as if you were in India. And then I thought, I says, oh, so that's what's happening. I'm experiencing, this is the presence, the way the Baba himself is introduced as presence, and which is people are vicariously, indirectly experiencing around me. And then I said, time and distance mean nothing to me, and that you will benefit equally, the same as if you were in India. Like that.
Signed, Baba.
Meher Baba.
Was Irwin there at that point?
No, Irwin was in India.
No, I mean, was he with Bob at that point?
Yes. Yes.
The telegram was sent.
Yes.
Because Bob and the Wisdom told both of you to come together.
Yes. Yes.
Was Bob originally upset at all when you didn't show up or anything? Did he ask Irwin about that?
Yes. Yes. And Baba said to Irwin, he said it to the effect it would be better it would have been better if you both had come together. Other than that,
So he was a little disappointed.
But then on the other hand, the way Baba put it in the telegram, that I would benefit equally. He said the same, and that's where all of the presence was coming from. So Baba was introducing me to his presence in a very dynamic way.
You had found the light.
In that respect, it was, yes, I would say that was the startup, was like the startup of that experience. That was like...
Edward, before you go further in the story, could I just ask you, what is the age difference between you and Irwin?
A couple of years, about 2 years.
And you're the older?
Yeah, Irwin's the older.
Irwin is 2 years older.
Irwin is the older, and how is it that you were so close and that you were seeking these things together?
Well, actually, we weren't seeking these things together. I didn't know what Irwin was up, what was going on with him. I knew he, at one point, that my father began to speak about Irwin's behavior being a little different, and then I started to wonder what my father was talking about at that earlier time, but other than that, I didn't really see anything out of the ordinary as far as my brother, other than that he was a little more quieter. That was all, but Irwin never spoke about looking for anything or that he was seeking anything, so I had no awareness of where he was at or what was going on.
Thank you. Irwin had told me that he was deeply inspired by the movie The Ten Commandments, and that it awakened him to a deep longing for God when he saw it, and from then on he started seeking very powerfully. But he never talked to you about that, did he?
No.
Do you know what year he saw it? meeting? Would have been
Well, this would have been in 1959.
when it came out, the Ten Commandments?
Well, apparently that must have been the time, because that was the time when there was like this change in Irwin, but I had not known that he...
Was there any other reason that you and Irwin were closer to each other beside the chronology than the other brothers?
No, just that Irwin, the only thing that Irwin showed at some point, like an interest in Mayor Baba, and which I didn't know whether he would even have any interest, because I didn't know that he'd be interested.
But your
Just that,
understanding was to call him, not the other two brothers. When you had read
Yeah.
Humanity, you first went to tell Irwin about it.
yeah, because of what my father, I think it had to do with what my father had said, that Irwin's behavior was somewhat, there was a change, and so I figured this might fit into it. You know, I mean, it was my own interpretation, something I imagined. I says, you know, it could be just imagination, that's all. Nothing more, nothing less, like that.
Go on.
Okay.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
So I says, so then I realized that, again, I began to become more introduced, like awakened to the power of Baba when he wants to, because this is all new to me, the experience of the spiritual presence of God. So then after that, I went out onto to the beach, and they have like this walkway where people walk, and because I still had not realized the magnitude of the greatness of Baba's being. I mean, it was still new to me. And another way he was letting me know, again, like the power of his power was when I was walking along the beach, and there was a couple that passed by me, and then they both did a U-turn. They both did a total U-turn and just looked at me like that, and they just held that gaze. And they both turned around and continued on. And then I started to realize, it was becoming clearer and clearer that what that awakened me to is that Baba can reach people through a person. If he wishes, he can transmute through through an individual.
Yeah. But beside being aware of the effect that you were having on others, were you feeling Mayor Baba's personality, or his darshan, or a sense of his presence?
I wasn't aware of like, no, I wasn't aware of like a darshan. I referred to it as like feeling the presence of God. I didn't, connected, it wasn't like that Baba was, like he was the Messiah. It was like a lot of things that I picked up on hadn't really got to a point in me, or had really grown to a point where I had really grasped the real avatarhood of Baba. It was like brand new. Everything was brand new as it was happening. So I was kind of like learning as I was going along. Like I said, I didn't know why Baba was asking people to love him, that they should love him. Certain things were a little confusing, but as far as him being the avatar, I had realized he was the Messiah. But there were things that I hadn't really had the knowledge of, or the learning, or the experience of yet, in that respect. So I was very, very young in spirituality in that respect. But as time was to go on, then I would learn more. So anyhow, at least I now was fully aware. The latest thing I became aware is that Baba could reach someone if he so wished through someone. That I was observing and had witnessed. Irwin, but the only thing I felt very strong about, that God needs to be experienced. he needs to be experienced, and that Baba could really be helpful in this respect. He could know the ins and the outs of what a person, to remove that, what it would take for that veil to be removed, so a person could have that divine sight, so to speak, in that respect. So anyhow, so Irwin then came back from India, and Irwin was very quiet. You know, he wasn't saying anything. And I began to, he says, Irwin, I says, what happened? Finally I had to speak to him. He'd been back 2 or 3 days already, and he hadn't said anything. And so I says to him, Irwin, what happened? And this is something you'll like, Ira. The only thing he said to me was, I didn't experience God realization. And he was very upset. Irwin was very upset.
He thought maybe that could happen just in an initial meeting?
Yes, because because Baba had said that if he so wished it, that if he had the whim, he could give that experience to a person in a flash. And he said it didn't even matter whether they were a saint or a sinner, because God was in everyone, and he could raise a person to that height. Such was the authority of the avatar. So Irwin was totally very aware and very sensitive to the fact that Baba, if he so wished, that he could extend that to him.
And he hadn't had that whim to him.
Yes, and then I'll share something else then that might be helpful, because Baba, knowing Irwin's what his desire was, and that Baba, he had read that Baba said the purpose of his purpose is so that people could experience God, and that they shouldn't come to him for other things. So Irwin was there he felt in a very legitimate sense. He wasn't there for other things, so why not? So at one point, Baba asked, he started to ask people in the room, do you experience my love? He said that to one of his devotees. And they said, well, no. And then he said to someone else, do you experience my love? And they said, well, I don't know, Baba. And then another person had been with him for a long time. He asked, do you experience my love? And they says, no, not that I can say, Baba. I don't think I have that experience. And then he turned to Irwin, and he said to Irwin, he said, what do you think, Irwin? And he says, well, what I think is that he says, as far as yourself, he says, well, I would like to experience your love, Baba. And he says, yes, but what about all these people? They haven't experienced it. Why you? And then Irwin said, well, Baba, you should give it to me, and they should experience it too.
I love that.
And so then Baba said, well, if I gave you my love, he says, what would happen if you you were to explode? And you might explode.
I explode.
Yeah. And Irwin said, well, what would be wrong? Irwin said, what would be wrong with that? Yeah. And then Baba said, nothing. But in another way, this still didn't help Irwin in his dilemma, because nothing was changing. His consciousness was still the same. And so he told him that he should, go over and spend some time with Francis Barbizon. And so he figured, well, why should I spend time with Francis Barbizon if I'm right here with you? Anyhow, Irwin spent a little bit of time with Francis Barbizon, and I asked him this was much later on, what had happened. He said, well, with Francis, I saw that he had the balance between mind and heart. That's what I saw from being with him.
Was it on that trip that Irwin, I know there's one point where Baba asked, might have been when you were there, asked Irwin what he wanted. and he said God realization. And Baba looked very, very seriously and said, you have no idea the suffering that would entail to reach that. You have something to that effect. You have the immensity of what you're asking for. You have no sense of it. Was that on that trip, or were you there?
Well, I don't recall, no, I wasn't there. I don't really recall that, but I do recall there was one instance where when Erwin was in the car with Baba, and it had to do with the experience which you're talking about, and then Baba turned around to Erwin and asked him if he was willing to pay the price. That's all he asked. And Erwin thought about the price. His mind started really working. What is the price? What is the price? And then Erwin remembered about the discourses and about the nature of the ego and the elimination of the ego. And then Erwin realized, well, to eliminate this ego would be like torture. And that how much torture could he take before finally he couldn't, he would have to say, I can't take any more. And so he saw that the price, there wasn't, that, it would be almost, I guess, he just said he didn't know. Erwin didn't know whether he could pay that kind of a price that Baba was talking about. And then Baba told him not to worry about it. Just not to worry about it. And so perhaps that gave Erwin some thought as to what was a little bit involved in as far as the aspiring aspirant and the party, the things he has to go through for the experience of God, which you're talking about. But anyhow, so anyhow, when after Erwin returned, Erwin and I shortly right after that, we began to plan, how we could go to India to see Baba without my father knowing about it. That was the next thing. That was the uppermost thing. So,
How old were you?
well, at that time, was in 1959, I was 19, I just turned 20, and now I had just turned 21. So I was just moving where it's going to be 21, I was moving towards that legal age. However, knowing my father, we knew that even if I would be of legal age, he could do something to disrupt the plan somehow that would cause enough of a delay that we would not be able to be there on time. If he knew, he'd get the idea of whiff of what we were planning, he'd come up with a real good plot. So anyhow, so Erwin and I began to plan that trip. So we would usually meet. What I came up with, I said to Erwin, I says, what I got to do is move out of the house. So then, if at least you're not there for a day or two, he won't know. But if we're both not in the house or sleeping at night, then he would definitely know something is up and start to make those long distance calls. He'd go at it again. He wouldn't hesitate. So now the next thing. So anyhow, I did move out of the house, and then Erwin came up with some kind of a thought while I was living somewhere else now that maybe we should send Baba some gifts. And so Erwin came up with an idea to send some gifts to Baba. So I think it was a camera and some other paraphernalia, and I says, I don't know if Baba needs this. So, but Erwin says it's a good idea. So I says, all right, send the gifts. So anyhow, in the meantime, we'd sent the gifts. It's a camera and some other odds and ends stuff, and then got back a reply after they received it, and then the reply was that it's nice that you send these gifts, but this is not what Baba is here for. Baba's not here, to be receiving gifts from people. That's not Baba's purpose. So the gifts, so these things, So now we have to think of how we can get all these things back to you. And it got very involved. Letters with between the government and all kinds of red tape, and he says, and letters from Edich and everything to try to figure out, how to go about this thing now so that it was all returned. And it got very involved and technical. It took weeks and weeks to get these things back, and that Baba does not need these things. So anyhow, then in the meantime, then Owen and I did come up with some ideas as to how to come up with to make money. One of the things was that my father now was going to be away for a while. So, the place I was at, I told this one guy that would come by, and he would sleep, he would sleep there on the floor at times. And so I told him, if he wanted to continue to sleep, on the floor, because it was air conditioned and everything, he'd have to start paying, because now I realized I'm going to have to make the money to go to India for when Baba calls, should have to have the means. So I told him that he needed to start paying some money, and he was glad to continue to sleep there, and it wouldn't cost him very much. And so he said, well, that's not, he doesn't see where, he would pay, that's necessary to pay or anything. And I says, well, I'm going to need the money now. That's the reason why. And you're still welcome to stay. So he thought, apparently he thought I was going to be, really soften up and say, tell him not to worry about it. His name was Whitey. So I said, no, Whitey. I says, if you want to stay here, if you want to sleep here, you're welcome to sleep here, but you got to pay, and it's only going to be a minimal. I think it was something like $5 that time, $5 a week or something like that. I was asking him, and he didn't seem to think that was a good idea. I says, it's very cheap, and you're getting air conditioning on top of it. It's very boiling outside. So I says, Whitey, if you come around again, you're going to find the door locked. You just can't be coming in anymore like this. So one day the door was locked, and he was shocked. And but I was very serious about getting the money for India. So then I saw him a few days later. He says, you know what this thing cost me? You're locking the door? He says, I had to take a motel room. I says, yeah, what you had to pay for the motel room for one night, you could have stayed a whole week at my place. So I'm still giving you the option. So then he said he would pay the money. So then there was other things. I told him I'd get his clothes ironed and everything, if he paid for that. So then he says, well, how much would it be? He says, just a couple of dollars to get everything ironed, cleaned and ironed. So he says, well, that's a good idea. So then I would take I would take his suit and stuff, and I would bring it to my mother. And then she would wash it and iron it, and bring it over to him, and they'd pay me. Like that. So whatever way I could come up with an idea to make money, then that's what I did. Then my father said that he's going to be going away somewhere and needs to have the place taken care of, the house and all. So Owen and I came up with an idea. He said, he wants us to take care of the house, and that everything should be fixed up and things like that. So when he came back, what he saw was that we had landscaped the entire lawn. The whole lawn was now re-landscaped with bushes and everything, and this cost money, of course, for labor and everything that was done. So that was another way that we were making some money. We started planting bush. We'd go out to the nursery, buy bushes, and plant the grass, and the sod grass and everything. And so he was very pleased. He says, this is really wonderful. When he came back, he says, this looks really good. He says, what inspired you guys to make this place look so good? And he says, well, Merlin said to my father, well, we thought, you'd like it. And then there was another thing. There was a little dog that was to be taken care of. And so I came up with the idea that, that we'd be part of like a vet. In other words, the cleaning of the dog, and the cleaning, the shampooing, and things like that of the dog. And so then there would be a bill, of course. So the dog got shampooed every day, and the dog didn't understand why it needed it, and you could see the dog was confused, and it was getting a bath every single day, but it kept the bill going up. You know, we did another charge. And,
In the name of God.
pardon?
All in the name of God.
Yes. So whatever way, then there was another thing that we came up with. There's one of the places that my father owned, they wanted the garage knocked down. It was a double garage that was used where someone could live in at one time. So the people that had the house there had heard my father wanted the place demolished. So Aaron and I had heard, came to find out about that, and so then Aaron and I became a demolition crew. We announced to the people that it would now be taken care of, and the garage, the double garage in the back would now be demolished and taken away, and they could set up their basketball court and whatever they wanted to do. So that was another thing that so we took that. Well, it was quite a thing to take that thing down beam by beam, piece by piece, and still the roof wasn't coming down, and some beams were holding it up, and it was more of the central beams that were holding up the entire place. And in order to get those central beams down so it would cave in, and then we could break it up, we had to go inside there and put one beam against it, and then another beam out against that beam, and then all the way we would hit one beam and it kept hitting all the other beams to knock those beams that were holding up the center part of the roof. In the meantime, the people in the house were watching the demolition crew, the way they were demolishing this place. And they were very, very watching it like a television drama as to how this thing was really going to happen with the boards coming all the way out into the yard and hitting it with a sledgehammer. And then there was the big boom, of course. It came down, and then a good part of it was we had a lot of it was carted. Mostly we had a huge truck that carts away all kinds of debris. So they came, and then the little rest we put in my father's. And my father had a Riviera car, so it was a nice new Riviera. And then the rest of the little debris we put in the trunk, and then had the trunk vacuumed out afterwards. So, and then then there was another how we were making. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we were making the money at that time. And so anyhow, then came the time when we got the news that Baba was going to be seeing people. So in the meantime, Erwin and I had saved up quite a bit of money through all the different odds and end jobs that we had been doing. And so we now had the funds to do these things. And also we had and then also there was, but anyhow, we had the funds. So at that time, when then my father came to realize what was going on, that we had monies and things, and we were planning to use it to see him, to see Mayor Baba. So anyhow, he said, you guys, even though I know you got money now, I'm still going to see to it that you're not going to go, because this thing is useless. What's going on here? So anyhow, he wrote Bob a letter, saying that he didn't like anything that was going on, and this was not good, and it was not helping them, and it was breaking up the whole family.
Your father wrote Bob a letter?
Yes. So then Baba said something that what we should do, with the help of one of the disciples, what we should do is to turn over all the money to my father that was our own earned money, and then ask him, explain to him that this is a spiritual journey we're on, and that we should, that he, that he should say, okay, give us his blessings and to go. And the way to do it was first just to hand him over all the money.
Wow.
And then ask for his blessings. So anyhow, that was so then we went up to my father's office, and because if this was the way that Baba was working, then we would do what Baba said. So came up to his office, and and my father was surprised to see us. He says that we actually were there. He couldn't figure this out. Why are they all dressed up in a suit, ties, and they're here in front of me now. So he says, "Is there something that I need to know?" And he says, "Yes, we're, as you know, of course, we're planning to go to India, and what we would like is, well, first of all, we would like, to have your blessings in this matter. But to show you, good faith, we're going to turn over all of our money to you." And he says, "You're going to turn over all your money to me?" And he said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, what's the trick?" We told him there's no trick. And then he says, "Well, I'd like to see this actually, I want to see this thing actually, how you're going to do this." And he said to us, "Are you willing to me to go to the bank with you, and you withdraw your money and give it to me?" And he said yes. And he couldn't believe his ears. He says, "You're actually going to go to the bank, withdraw the money, and give it to me?" And we said yes. So he says, "Oh boy, this is really something," he says. So he gets up out of his office chair, and then he goes with us to the bank, and we're talking. Anyhow, we go to the bank, and we withdraw the money, and then he says, "When we get to the office, you give it to me?" And he says, "Yes." So we go into the office, and we give him the money, and then he's looking at us, and he says, "Well, the only thing I'm wondering, now, how you're going to go to India." And we said to him, "Well, what we would like to do is to have your blessings. And if we, when you have your blessings, and then you give us money so that we can go to India." Because no matter, with him, you had to speak that way. Because with him, if you earn, no matter how much, whatever money you earned from him, you never earned it. It was the only way you got money, even if you worked. Was he said, "This is the only reason you ever get money, anything from me, is out of the goodness of my heart. And so don't think you ever earn anything." So whether you were, the vice president or whatever you were, it didn't matter. It was all out of the goodness of his heart. So you had to talk to him that if he would extend the money to us, that it would be very nice of him. That that he could relate to. So anyhow, he says, "Well, give me time to think about this." So he said, "I have to have time to think about this here." So then the following day, we approached him, and he was sitting. He had like a marble floor downstairs. He had a house with a marble floor, and then he was sitting in his chair, which was a golden chair, like a throne, which he enjoyed, and so he's sitting in his golden chair, and the throne chair, and we approached him, and he said, "Well, what have you come up with, Dad? We'd like to know if we could, have your blessings so that we could, go and you could help us this way." And he said, "You know something?" He says, "I thought about this whole thing. And what I came up with is that I would have to be crazy to give you guys anything." So in other words, you get nothing. And he says, "Well, it's for spiritual reasons." He says, "Well, where you should go." He says, "To an institution. That's where people like you go." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Because the first thing you learn is that when it's through people like you that the airlines get rich. Because they don't know what they're doing. And they make lots of money off of people like you. So